One of your major performance assessment tasks in this class is to conduct an occupational interview and then write a paper. This lesson is formally introducing that assignment with its due date within, I think it's 4 weeks. And the reason why I'm introducing it so early is to give you an opportunity to start working on it because it is a really big project. It's essentially twofold. Conducting an interview that will require you to gather information, listen, observe, and then you're going to write about that experience, observations, and how you listened. That is what our occupational interview project is all about. The first part of this project is the interview. This is essentially an informational interview. Sooner or later, your networking and personal research are likely to point you towards people whose knowledge, experience, and contacts could shape your career. For this assignment, you'll be interviewing someone who holds an occupation that you hope to someday have or that you have a genuine interest in. This will allow you to gain more insight and hopefully create a networking opportunity. There are 3 goals when conducting an informational interview. The first goal is to help you conduct research to help you understand a job, organization, and field. The second goal is to be remembered favorably by the person you are interviewing. This is where those communication concepts that we are working on and will continue to work on will assist you in this portion of the interview. And the third goal of an informational interview is to gain referrals to other people who might be willing to help you in the future, such as creating a networking opportunity with that person that you're interviewing, which could potentially lead to a letter of recommendation after graduation. That's happened for a couple of my students who have participated in this opportunity. I had a criminal justice student who interviewed somebody in a field that she wanted to someday be in, and throughout the entire process, she was creating a network and a favorable opinion from the person she was interviewing, which then eventually led her to get a letter of recommendation from that person when she started applying for jobs. So the occupational interview should last approximately an hour. But in order for you to do that, you need to be able to contact the person that you want to interview. And you are going to do that by either writing an email, placing a telephone call, or having a face-to-face conversation. I don't mind if the person you are interviewing with already has a relationship with you. I don't mind if it's a family member. It would be great if you could reach out to somebody to get to know, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So I've had plenty of people who have interviewed family members and friends who hold an occupation that they either someday want to have or that they have a genuine interest in. And I've also had some people, like with the example of the criminal justice student, she found somebody in that particular field and reached out to them asking for an interview. However you do that is completely up to you. I just ask that when you contact them, be sure to introduce yourself and then explain the reason for the interview. Explain the assignment that you're doing for this class. Emphasize that you are simply attempting to gain information, that you're not asking for a job or job placement in the future. Be sure to identify the amount of time you are likely to take for this interview. And again, it should last approximately an hour. You're going to ask 7 to 10 primary questions, and I'm sure you'll have some follow-up questions in there. Be sure to state a range of dates and times that you are available to meet, whether that be face-to-face, Skype, or FaceTime. I ask that you avoid calling over the phone because you're going to be observing nonverbal cues, and it will be very difficult for you to be able to observe cues if you can't see and hear the person at the same time. So that's why I limit you to face-to-face, physically being in front of one another, or using things like FaceTime or Skype. When you state the range of dates and times you are available to meet, try to be as flexible as you can. It's easier when they know what times work for you to make it work in their schedule as well. So again, you can contact the person that you want to interview via email, over the telephone, or through a face-to-face conversation. Be sure to explain the reason for the interview, emphasizing that you're not looking for a job, you're just attempting to collect information for this assignment. Identify the amount of time that you'll take, approximately 1 hour, and state the range of dates and times that you are available. Next, let's talk about how you want to structure this interview. When you're structuring the interview, you want to have an opening of sorts, and the opening is where you establish a rapport with the person that you're interviewing. This is where trust and comfort are established. Be sure to, for formality's sake, introduce yourself, remind them of what the interview is about, thank them for taking the time to be interviewed, and talk about how the interview will work. Remember, this is about you. You are structuring and organizing this from beginning, middle to end, and you should have a certain goal to get an expected outcome. So this is an informational interview where you are attempting to gain information and insight, but you're also observing nonverbal cues and you're engaging in listening, because this is what's going to help you write that paper at the end. So once you've established a rapport, you've thanked them for their time, you've given them a brief overview of what the interview is about and how it's going to go, let's talk about the body of the interview. This is where the question and answer session take place. In a couple of minutes, I'll be walking through the different types of questions you can ask, but for right now, specifically focusing on structure, the body of the interview is where you're going to ask those 7 to 10 primary questions, where you're going to ask follow-up questions, and where the bulk of the interview is going to take place. After the body, there is a proper closing. The closing just kind of sums up all the major points of your discussion during that 1 hour time frame. It also allows for additional questions that you might have to gain clarification on what was said during the interview. It's also an opportunity for the person you're interviewing to ask you any questions. And then make sure at the very end of the interview, when you're getting ready to finish, thank them again for their time, because they're doing you a huge service by meeting with you and allowing you to practice these skills. So once you've thanked the person for their interview, don't forget to ask them if it's okay if you have additional follow-up questions, if it's okay that you contact them, and ask them of the most appropriate way to do that. Is that through an email, telephone call, or meeting again face-to-face? But the structure of the interview, the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. In the introduction, thanking them for their time, giving them a brief overview of what to expect during the interview. The body of the interview, asking those 7 to 10 primary questions, asking follow-up questions, and the bulk of the interview taking place. And then the closing, where you sum up all the major points, allow for clarification, and then thank the person for interviewing. So whatever you do in terms of the questions, keep them you-focused. This is about you gaining understanding and information on a deeper level about an occupation that you find interesting or that you hope to someday go in. So keep these questions all about you. Thinking back to the discussion we had on language and what we learned about the importance of language, that will help you to format those questions. So you want to ask factual questions. These are straightforward that request information on actual experiences that the person has had. You also want to ask open questions. Open questions allow for the person you're interviewing to answer any way that they choose to answer. It's really opinion, it can be opinion based, but it's really open to the fact that it's not leading them down to a path to a certain response, but getting them to open up and giving you more thoughtful responses from that person's perspective. And then we have direct questions. Direct questions are straight and to the point, but you want to be mindful of your communication competencies. So you want to avoid questions that aren't you focused. So what I mean by that is, don't ask the question, what kind of salary do you make? We can change that to be indirect, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the direct question should be you, the person who's gaining the information, focused. You'll have those primary questions. Those 7 to 10 primary questions are the initial questions to get the interview going and to keep it moving forward. Next, we have neutral questions. Neutral questions give the interviewee an opportunity to respond without any sort of influence. It kind of is like an open question, but neutral is just, you're asking a very general question where the interviewee will make their response authentic to themselves. Next, we have hypothetical questions, and hypothetical questions are those what-if situations. So you're asking not necessarily about a specific time, making it factual, but a what would you do in this case, making it hypothetical. Next, you have opinion-based questions, and opinions allow for the person you're interviewing to give their interpretation as a response. Closed questions lead to a specific result. They're more measurable by nature, so they're the ones that are yes, no. They can also be multiple choice, like you're asking for a variety and they can pick one. But closed questions lead down to a specific result. Indirect questions make the question less about personal experience and more about general experience. So if we go back to that question about salary, instead of saying what do you make or how much money do you make, you could ask a question, what could one expect to make in a position like this? Or what is the expected salary a person could potentially make in a position like this? That way it's more indirect, it's less about that person and their experience, more about in general. Then we have secondary questions that are also noted as follow-up questions. These are based upon the primary question that you ask. A secondary question is used to obtain clarification to a response that was given. And then we have leading questions, and these directly signal to a specific desired response. So when you ask a question, you are setting up the question to give the person that's interviewing a limited response that you're guiding them to give. All right, so those are the types of questions that you want to ask. You want to make sure that you ask a variety of questions so that way you can get a well-rounded understanding of that person's occupation and of the response that they're giving you. Once the interview is over, a nice added touch would be to send a follow-up thank you letter or note. This can be handwritten, it can be typed up, it can be emailed. When you're putting this together, make sure you have the person that you are addressing, and then that's the to line, and then the from line is allowing or letting the person know who this is coming from. So it's coming from you. Be sure to have a subject if you're sending an email. Remember the 5 P's to email competency. So have a clear subject line that relates to the content in the message. The date, it should be automatically there. You don't need to necessarily put it there unless you're handwriting the letter. And then in the body, be sure to thank the individual that you interviewed. Mention a particular piece of information or interaction that you had that was positive with that person, and then end with a salutation and again your contact information. That's a nice little added touch, and it's really nice. I've received follow-up thank you letters, and it's really nice to randomly get those for something that you had no problem doing, but the acknowledgement that it meant so much to the person that obtained the information is a nice little added touch. It also makes you memorable. All right, so that's how you want to structure and organize the interview itself. Let's take a couple of minutes and just go through the paper because it's 2 parts. So after you've had your initial interview, make sure you write notes on the responses you received, as well as notes about what you observed non-verbally, because you'll write a 3 to 4 page paper that will have 2 sections. The first section will be 1 to 2 pages articulating what you learned about your future occupation and the person that you interviewed. And the second section, 1 to 2 pages, will be spent responding to the following questions in essay format. Through your observation, you are going to analyze the different nonverbal cues that the person you interviewed used. And you want to identify what those types of nonverbal cues are. Then you're going to talk about the interpretations that you, the listener, made based upon those cues. Following that, you're going to identify how those nonverbal cues affected the interview. If they affected the interview, you'll articulate that, but then you'll tell us how they affected the interview. If they did not affect the interview, you need to articulate why they didn't. Oftentimes, students take this as a negative, like that the effect has to be negative, but when we start to talk about nonverbal cues, you'll understand that nonverbal cues regulate what's happening verbally, substitute what's happening verbally. Sometimes they can contradict what's happening verbally, or enhancing what's happening verbally. So taking that into consideration will help you to understand how to answer that question. Then you'll talk about whether or not the nonverbal cues reinforced any related verbal messages. And then going back to our discussion on listening, you're going to identify the different types of listening that took place, the strategies you used to keep engaged in listening during the interview, provide specific examples upon the different types of listening that took place, and then you'll talk about the role paraphrasing had during your interview. And that's the second part of the paper that will be 1 to 2 pages in length. Your overall paper should be organized in essay format, so you should have a clear introduction that has a thesis statement, and you need a signal that you're getting ready to conclude at the very end, and you need to have a restatement of the thesis. When you're talking about things that are happening in the body, what happened during the interview, and then answering those questions, essay format means that you are avoiding the question-answer format. Essay format streamlines everything in your paper to move from the introduction to the body to the conclusion. Your paper, along with the length requirement of 3 to 4 pages, should have 12-point Times New Roman font and should be double-spaced. If you look at the rating scale, that will help you understand how the points are divvied out in the scoring guide. So this particular assignment is worth 100 points. It's equivalent to a midterm exam that you would have in maybe one of your other courses. But because this is a performance-based course, you are going to be performing. So you're showing me through written communication your experience that during the interview, and then the questions that relate to nonverbal communication and listening. So the scoring guide just shows you how those 100 points are divvied out, and you can look at that at your leisure. So that's a brief overview of how you want to structure and organize the occupational interview, the kinds of questions that you want to ask, submitting a follow-up, and then how you want to structure and organize the paper that you'll turn in to me. Throughout this process, if you have any questions, please let me know right away. You can email me, call, or stop by. You can also use Cisco Spark during my online office hours if that works for you. Otherwise, good luck.